This is Enacting the Kingdom, a podcast about liturgical worship. I'm Fr Yuri, an Orthodox Christian priest with a lifelong desire to keep learning. I'm joined by my friend and teacher, Father Geoffrey Reddy. Father Geoffrey is the director of the Orthodox School of Theology at the University of Toronto and holds a doctorate in liturgical theology. Father Geoffrey, we're here.
Thank you.
We are here for season 3.
It feels like a good day to begin something new.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's probably been about a year since we recorded our first ever episode. So it's good to be here with you. And I'm excited to start a new series. We just finished a series on Vespers. So if you want to listen to that, you can go back into our podcast archives. We don't have that on YouTube. But we've just finished a series on Vespers, and we thought we'd do something a little bit different. That we would actually do a series not on one of the services of the hours, but on a sacramental service. So before we even dive into it, before we dive into baptism and all that kind of stuff, Father Geoffrey, can you just give a quick recap of the difference between what we call like liturgy of the hours versus like a sacramental liturgy?
Okay, well, the obvious difference off the bat would be the occasion on which these things happen, right? So liturgy of the hours, as its name implies, has to do with, the kind of passing of time in the church and the way that we mark that time with a whole series of services. So every day, every week, every 8 weeks, these all have kind of cycles in which we keep a rhythm of services throughout every day. In the Vesper service that we focused on in our first season was all about that service that begins the day in every evening, which is at sunset. And so on any given day you have Vespers, right? So it's not a matter of waiting for the opportune moment or, oh my goodness, today should be a day on which we have Vespers. Vespers is appointed for every day of the year.
Right.
But the sacramental services or the Holy Mysteries are what you could say occasional services. In other words, not that we just do them every once in a while, but that we do them when there is occasion to do them, right? When there's a reason to do them. In other words, there's a sacrament to be served. In this case, somebody is to be received into the church. And so that need is responded to with a service, and that service is baptism. And that can actually be celebrated most of the year, although as we'll talk about in this season, there are key moments at which it's more appropriate to do so. In fact, one very key one, out of which actually the whole structure of the service is actually created. So we'll talk about that. But in practice, baptism can be celebrated nearly any day of the year. And so it's the occasion that gives rise to the service rather than just simply the fact that it's another day and another hour at which we could pray.
Right. So baptism is a service that a lot of people have attended, right? Whether you're Orthodox or not Orthodox, even if you never go to church and you only watch TV, you've been exposed to, a Christian version of baptism, right? Or some sort of Christian denominational version of baptism, right? I'm thinking even there's a scene from The Office, which centers around a baptism, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this ceremony is in the public consciousness. When you talk about baptism, people do have those things in their minds. And I think, for most, let's say, unchurched people, when you think of the topic of baptism, there's two things that would come to mind, like kind of on extremes, right? You would have one side that would say, well, you're just indoctrinating a child into sort of a religion or something like that and not giving them a choice. But on the other hand, people might see it just as sort of like a nice way of having a symbolic entry into the world for this new child, which is sort of like a nice thing. So yeah, I wasn't really going anywhere with a question with that, Father Geoffrey, more so of an observation that I think people are familiar with baptism, but probably not familiar with the intricacies of an Orthodox baptismal ceremony.
Well, that's important. And as we embark on this series, I think one of the things we'll have to bear in mind is that people already have a lot of ideas
right
about what baptism is, maybe from films or from books or from their own personal experience. And that's something we need to kind of contend with. In fact, it may very well even be that people who are Orthodox show up at Orthodox baptisms with these preconceived ideas and therefore miss a lot of what's there because they've already predetermined what it is that they're watching, right? And so as we take a kind of closer look at the services, really, because there's a whole series of things that take place when we bring someone into the church, whether they are infant or whether they are older, like adults and so forth. As we look at and indeed through those services, because they point to an understanding of life and about our purpose here, and that's really important to take note of. And I think sometimes having all those ideas in our heads already, we've determined that's all that's going on, and that's all we see, that's all we experience, and that can be sometimes the most difficult thing of all. It's one thing if it's a totally new experience, you're open to all possibilities, but here maybe part of our job in this series will be just kind of, I don't know, cracking open a window and letting some fresh air in where already the thing has been quite predetermined and maybe stale at this point. So even for Orthodox who think they know what baptism is, let's strive to kind of expand the imagination a little bit.
Right. There's a common saying that I've heard in Orthodox circles, and I'm sure it's present in other Christian denominations and other religions as well. But you have this saying called, hatch, match, and dispatch, right? This idea that people really only come to church when they need to, hatch, when they have a baby, right? They get it baptized. Match, well, you come back for, you'd never come back to church until you get married. Then you come back to church and you get married. And then when you die, dispatch, right? And I know priests and clergymen, and they try and fight against that sort of only coming to church for those big events. But it sort of happens where baptism is this sort of really profound ritual in people's lives that even those who don't actually come to church can still see the beauty and the meaning that is present in that ceremony. And I guess, I'll throw it to you. Like, why do you think that is? Like, marriage, funerals, and baptisms seem to be the three big occasions that people come back to church. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, to a certain extent, the Holy Mysteries do kind of map onto significant moments in life. That may not be true of every single one of them. Some of them are repeated a lot more regularly, like Divine Communion, Holy Eucharist, which we have at every divine liturgy. But things like baptism with chrismation, that goes hand in hand with that. In the West, of course, chrismation as a sacrament is a separate thing as confirmation. So that becomes another kind of moment of life passage, in early teens. Marriage, even, arguably things like ordinations or whatever are kind of life moments or stages. And then, of course, at the end of life as well. So I think there's a sense in which human beings want to ritualize and make ceremonies out of key moments in their life. And they want also to do that with all of the ceremonial that church can offer, whether it's the beautiful architecture, the nice setting, the vestments, the songs, and so forth. A lot of things that people don't ordinarily surround themselves with, they kind of want to repair to when you have these kind of key moments. So, in speaking about people who wouldn't ordinarily be said to have a Christian commitment of any kind or any kind of church membership or regular practice and so forth, but they will kind of think of, okay, it's our family tradition. They'll even do things like, well, I was baptized in such and such a church, so we'll go there. Even though we live miles away from there now, we'll go there because that's the family church, or that's the graveyard where our family members are buried. So let's make sure that kind of all the family events are connected to that. And I've seen this in my own kind of extended family as well. I mean, there are family members I have who would have traveled back to England in order to do these ceremonies. They live in Canada now, but the family church, is in, Billingshurst in West Sussex. And so they'll go there, and that's where generations upon generations, you can count back hundreds of years where the family have been hatched, matched, and dispatched. And so there's this kind of layer of, I don't know, a kind of deeper sense of tradition and belonging. It's about ancestry. It's about genealogy and family, traditions. People will do things like, well, this is the baptismal gown that I wore or my grandparents wore, or, and even around weddings, we have similar things, right? That you're supposed to wear. Part of your outfit for the day has to have something from tradition and some connection to the past. So I think people do this, in all kinds of very human, traditional ritual, kind of fashions. You're talking about the pushback, against, obviously, it's not ideal, but I do think there's an opportunity, therefore, at these moments. And maybe, again, in this series, we can talk about how the service of baptism is a real evangelical moment, right? It's a moment of mission and reaching out, because arguably you're going to have a more mixed, varied, and open congregation there than you have on an ordinary Sunday. So when you prepare your sermon for the baptism service, be mindful that there are people there who aren't ordinarily in church. So how are you going to address that? So the themes that we'll be looking for, evoking, and presenting in this series hopefully will be ones that not only kind of make Orthodox rethink some of the stuff they've missed in the service, but they could also be some of the things that are a real outward-facing, missionary, evangelistic opportunity for the church, as they are, in fact. Baptism and the whole mysteries of initiation that we'll be talking about is all about the expansion of the church. It's about the extending the reign of the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ, who reigns now, but only visibly for those who have been baptized and chrismated, in other words, who have been reborn. And so here's an opportunity to make that proclamation and to have others respond to it. It's not just a matter of a kind of private, inward-facing gathering. It is actually an extension of the kingdom as we celebrate this. So it's not a bad thing that we have people who come to church ever, right? I would not complain about it. I don't know that you intended to suggest that of the clergy who are pushing back against it. Really, we should be saying, oh my goodness, there are people here who aren't normally here. What do we do about that? Let's evangelize, right? I've
heard clergy do both, right? I've heard clergy complain about it, right? That, or think that these people are somehow, not that great that they only come to church. Or I remember growing up and thinking that I was superior because I wasn't a see and ear, a Christmas and Easter, and I had this false sense of pride that God somehow loves me more than them because I happen to go to church a couple more times a year. I think, that can be a real problem. And I think your view of, using this as an opportunity to, welcome back people that haven't been there in a while. I think there's something really valuable there that I kind of didn't grow up thinking that way. So I'm in recovery. How's that?
Very good.
So this term baptism, this word baptism is loaded with meaning, right? It's this fancy word. We don't use it in daily life, right? You don't go buy your pizza and then ask for, a sauce that you can baptize your pizza in. But like my understanding is
Greek,
right? In Greek. So my understanding is that in the Greek, it means to dip. Right? Or to put in or whatever, to dip. So it's sort of a little, I don't know, the English word, I think we've transliterated it from the Greek. So it bears a bit more religiosity, right? It's a bit more of a fanciful term. Is it fine that we keep the word baptism, or should we just start calling it dipping? I don't know. What's your perspective, Father Geoffrey?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real risk with some of these terms, right? And there are a whole slew of them that we do from the Greek. We just simply transliterate them, and therefore they are neologisms in English, words that have been just invented for this purpose, and therefore they have very little other meaning, as you say. I mean, there is a kind of metaphorical baptism that you can speak of, but it's only in relation to the fact that there's a Christian sacrament called baptism, right? So people talk about, well, my first day on the job was a baptism of fire, so but you're thinking of the religious idea as you say that, right? Whereas it wasn't originally, and most of these terms that are transliterated this way are not originally religious words in any sense. So even words like, repentance and all kinds of things, even in the church, the bishop, the overseer, is just, somebody who's looking over, supervising, and so forth. But we take episkopos, we turn it into bishop in English, and that has a very peculiar and specific religious meaning, and so forth. So we have all these words that have just become religious vocabulary. And I think part of the risk of that is that we just think of them in one sphere, right? And we don't kind of expand the meaning of those terms to kind of encompass what would be a more holistic and, in fact, integrating essentially worldview, right? So the real risk always in the Christian church is that we divide the world into secular and sacred. Here's the world that we have to live in, the workaday life where we have our families, our workplaces, our schools, and everything. And then we have church, and church operates on completely different principles. Well, that's not how Christian life is supposed to work. It's supposed to be utterly integrated, right? Christ came, united heaven and earth, and there is no secular sacred divide. We're supposed to be always and everywhere integrating the life of the Holy Spirit in the church with every aspect of our life. So if the particular religious vocabulary that we use over here in church means that we're not even thinking of it elsewhere, that's a risk, that's a danger, and that's something we need to at least be aware of, and then take stock of and do something about. So okay, we're loaded with this term, baptism, which essentially just means to dip or to immerse, so what can we do to kind of make sure that it's not just seen in this very narrow religious spiritual sense, and it has a kind of wider understanding? Well, we can do that through a proper look at the services and what is involved there. We can do that with better preaching, with better teaching, and so forth. So with podcasts and so forth, we can talk about the wider dimensions of this, that if we had maybe had a different word, would have been more obvious, perhaps, but I think we're always having to kind of make up the distance between reality and people's perception of it. So that there wouldn't be preaching or teaching if we didn't have that gap. So we just have to be aware of it as we talk about it. But you're right. The word baptism or baptize is used elsewhere, even in the scriptures, to talk about quite ordinary things, right? So Judas is said to baptize his bread, in the cup of the wine at the Last Supper. And so, obviously it doesn't have at all the same religious specificity there that, the word has come to take in English. But what does that mean? That we are doing something in and through this sacrament that is about immersion, about entering in, about plunging into something in order to arise. We're going to have to look at what all the dimensions of that are, rather than just sort of thinking of it as it's the name of a sacrament, and that, no matter what happens in that, it has that particular word associated with it.
Yeah. I think a lot of, in particular, if you are watching this or listening to this and you come from, let's say, a non-Orthodox kind of Christian background, and you've been in discussions of baptism, there's a lot of controversy over whether you should baptize infants or whether baptism should be reserved for adults who actually can consent to what they're doing. I've known of one Orthodox family in my life who, they really, really did not want to baptize their kids as babies. They wanted the kids to grow up and to make their own decision, which you can imagine in a Ukrainian Orthodox Church context would actually cause quite a bit of feather ruffling, because in the Ukrainian church that I grew up in, the practice was you baptize your babies at 40 days old. So often, if somebody from another Christian background says, "Oh, Father Yuri, does the Orthodox Church baptize babies?" I'll say, "Yes, we do," but the service itself is actually written for an adult, right? The baptism service kind of assumes that the person that's being baptized is an adult, because that person actually responds to questions from the presbyter. So I guess, Father Geoffrey, how would you, that question of, does the Orthodox Church baptize babies? Yes, we do, but the service is for an adult. How does the Orthodox Church square that idea of baptizing infants, but the actual service is written for an adult?
Right. And to fully answer this question would require, a fair amount of liturgical history and theology and so forth. But it would not be wrong to kind of sum that all up. We can maybe visit this throughout the series in different ways. But to sum it all up, it would be not wrong to say the normal, quote unquote, normal practice is to receive adults. But we have always extended that to households, which include people of all ages. And so when we read the book of the Acts of the Holy Apostles, and we hear about somebody who is received into the church and his whole household, we're assuming that meant not just people who were of age of reason, as that came to be defined, or people who were age of majority, adults, or even just simply those who were the kind of heads of the family. We assume that meant the entire household, whether that was elderly people, disabled people, children, the free people, the slaves, everybody who made up a household. And in kind of Greco-Roman society, that could be quite a large number of people, right? So from the very early days of the apostles, the assumption was that this was a community thing, and that all of our faith is interdependent, right? The highly individualistic understanding of rationality and of being able to consent and making a kind of individual decision. There's obviously a very personal dimension to baptism. We'll be talking about that. It is our death and resurrection and participation in the life of Christ, but it's always a communal one. It's a baptism into a body, and therefore it's something that we do together. And so the church has never shied away from receiving people who you wouldn't in an ordinary sense say have consented or been able to rationally express that. But that said, I mean, hundreds of years after the apostles, we have some of the greatest saints of the church who were waiting until they were adults to be received, even when their parents were saints. Some people like Saint Gregory the theologian famously wasn't received into the church by baptism until he was 30, even though he's in a saintly family, right? It's not like his parents had failed in their job or had somehow apostatized or something like that. So the normal practice, and that's reflected entirely in the text. We have no separate form of service for baptizing an infant. Everything assumes that the person is going to do things like lifting up their arms and putting down their arms and turning one direction and turning another and entering into a baptismal font and walking out of it themselves. We have to adapt. And in fact, it's fascinating that throughout the Orthodox world, there are all kinds of different ways that has been adapted for infants in terms of the practice, around that. But essentially, the norm is to receive adults. And in fact, throughout the entire, Middle Byzantine period, even when they were receiving children, they did actually wait several years. And we'll talk about this, I think, mostly in connection with how baptism was principally celebrated as a Paschal event. And my feeling about why, and my understanding of why it was 3, 4, and 5-year-olds who were brought to baptism, still before the age of reason, in a kind of Western rational understanding of that sort of thing. But but they waited until they had a capacity for remembering, I think, the event, because it was so connected with a festival that was celebrated every year. So we'll get back into that at some point. But so it's only very recently that you find this kind of practice you say has been picked up in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of insisting on a kind of 40-day thing. And it's not unfair to say that it's been largely under a kind of Western influence there. And Ukraine, I think, has felt that pressure maybe more than other parts of the Orthodox world as well, because that's where East and West kind of meet, in Ukraine, Poland, the whole history of the Church of Kiev and so forth. And so under a little bit of Western pressure, and the West obviously has had much more interest in immediately baptizing infants, because of course the alternative is hell, right? In a Western understanding in Christian theology, as opposed to the Eastern approach, which is that unbaptized babies do not go to hell is not our view, or sorry, it is our view that they do not go to hell, and
An important clarification.
which is an important clarification. And the best the West could do was say, well, okay, they go to hell, but it's like the best part of it. We'll call it limbo, but it's still part of hell, right? So obviously there's a real pressure. In fact, during the Western Middle Ages, it was 8 days, not 40 days. So Ukrainians are waiting far too long, taking great risks with their children in this regard. But it wasn't a concern. In the East, there wasn't this understanding that if you were unbaptized, you would necessarily go to hell. And so they would wait, for toddlers, I think, to form up the capacity for memory so that you would remember your baptism. Well, how interesting is that for everything we're about to talk about in this series, that baptism is so important that the church wanted to be sure you remembered yours, and you could be annually reminded of it because you would watch the other people at Pascha being baptized. And I think, that's going to be fascinating as we talk about all the different parts of the service, and having that real memory of your own baptism as a life-changing event, as in fact the most decisive event of your entire life, as opposed to simply something you find in your pictures, or your family can tell you a story about that, very private family event that took place on some Saturday afternoon in your very early days, and that sort of thing, which is just a ritual, a rite of passage, and so forth. No, this is the entire purpose of your life represented in this experience. And so you need to remember it. You need to return to it. You need to be reminded of it as often as possible. Return to it daily in your mind, in your spiritual journey towards the kingdom. And I think there's so much just wrapped up in that idea of you need to be conscious of it, as opposed to you need to be able to rationally articulate the faith in such a way that you earn a baptism. We don't go there, but I think we do go to the point where we say, remembering it and being conscious of it and being able to live out the reality of it. Because of course, in our baptism, as we'll be talking about, everything is given. It is our personal Pentecost, and we are made saints, and we have to just implement that in the rest of our life, not, earn the right to be called saints, but we are made saints in that, and we need to live out that grace, that outpouring of the Holy Spirit in our lives.
So the service of baptism is definitely designed kind of on an individual basis, where there's questions asked of a particular person who then responds, do you unite yourself to Christ? Yes, I unite myself to Christ, right? Questions like that. But it's also done like in the church, and there are kind of other people around. So for our last question today, to set up our series here, Father Geoffrey, is baptism about kind of the unique person and their journey, their personal journey, or is it about the community and the life of the community?
Yes. It is both. And I think one of the key things is that our understanding of what makes a unique human person in the Christian East is very much based on a life in community, an interdependent life, not an independent existence. So when we think of the personal commitment that one's own baptism and chrismation and reception of the divine Eucharist is all about, we don't think of that on an individualistic basis. We think of it on a personal basis, and persons are only persons in communion, are only persons in that interdependent, self-sacrificial love of the Trinity, reflected in the life of the assembly of those called into covenant relationship with the Trinity. And so, in fact, the individualistic thing is actually where one is less unique, right? The individualism of the world of sin, of this passing away age, is kind of boring, and it's kind of nondescript. It's kind of, has no character to it. Every sin is kind of like every other sin. It's only, if you want to talk about unique, proper individuality, it's in becoming a person in the fullness of what that means, in the likeness of an image of God, in communion with the church. It's the saints who are interesting, not the sinners. The saints are those who come into that kind of unique, place in creation. And so it's taking up that community life that's where we find our individual or unique place, our specificity, really, in the eyes of God and in the life of the world. And so that's why the community plays such an important, role here. Yes, there are confessions of faith made by the person being received and by his or her sponsor, but that confession of faith is the symbol of faith of the church. It's the Nicene Creed that we proclaim at every divine liturgy, and which is our shared faith. And it's, let us love one another, that with one mind we may confess, right? It's that shared life of the church into which we enter by that personal, conviction. And so it's essential that baptism take place in the whole community. It's not a private family affair. It's not something just simply for the family to organize with a few friends and have a party afterwards. It is essential that it's connected directly to the life of the local parish into which one is being received, the whole of the community. Ideally, it takes place within the celebration of a divine liturgy, which was where it was originally, set. And we'll see the structure of the service mirrors that and has come out of that much the same way as other sacraments like the holy matrimony or the crowning have come out of that. So it's really important that we reconnect it with that, and ultimately, if possible, with the whole of the liturgical life of that community. And so by putting it back into the rhythm of Lent and Holy Week and Pascha, as we'll be talking about, is another aspect of that reconnection with community. So yes, it's about the salvation of one, but salvation is never an individual thing. It's the life of the whole church. We are saved in community, in covenant relationship with one another and with the living God.
Well, thanks, Father Geoffrey. I'm really looking forward to the series, and I hope our audience gets a lot of value from it as well. I know I will.
Great.
Enacting the Kingdom is a patron-supported show, and if you're not a patron, you're only getting half of everything we create. If you'd like to join our growing community of supporters, please go to patreon.com/enactingthekingdom. Your patronage goes a long way to keeping this show going. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.